Hey everyone, I'm Ben, the Amateur Exegete, and this is episode 58 of Bible Study for Amateurs. Today's episode is Runaway Slave? Why was Onesimus, the slave of Philemon, with Paul? In the last episode, we ended by looking at verse 14, wherein Paul tells Philemon that while he wanted Onesimus to remain with him while he was imprisoned, he preferred to do nothing without your consent, in order that your good deed might be voluntary and not something forced. The good deed is, of course, having Onesimus stay with Paul and to be of service to him. But this raises the question, why was Onesimus with Paul in the first place? One possibility is that Onesimus was a runaway slave, and in his escaping he just happened upon Paul. Why had he run away? In verse 18, the apostle tells Philemon to forgive Onesimus of any wrongs or debts on Paul's account. While this doesn't necessarily mean that Onesimus had done anything wrong or owed anything to his master, it could be read that way. If that was the case, then perhaps Onesimus ran away to escape the anger of Philemon. While much of this is plausible, it seems far-fetched. As Eric Barreto writes in the Fortress Commentary on the Bible, the encounter of a runaway Onesimus and an imprisoned Paul seems all too serendipitous. What are the chances that they would meet and develop a close relationship, only to discover that Paul knew Onesimus's aggrieved master? Indeed. A more sophisticated version of this argument appears in Bart Ehrman's introduction to the New Testament. There he writes the following regarding the question of why Onesimus ended up with Paul. Recent studies of ancient Roman slavery law may provide an answer to this question. It was a legally recognized practice for a slave who had incurred his or her master's wrath to flee to one of the master's trusted associates to plead for his intervention. The associate then served as a kind of official mediator who would try to smooth out differences that had arisen through misunderstanding or even malfeasance. From this, Airman notes that it's possible Philemon had been wronged by Onesimus, angering him and causing the slave to flee to Paul. While visiting the apostle, he converts and becomes a Christ follower and, therefore, useful. This prompts Paul to request what he does in verses 15 and 16. This is a tantalizing possibility, one more plausible than that mere chance occasioned their acquaintance. Another possibility is suggested by Mitzi Smith in the Women's Bible Commentary. She notes that the possibility of manumission was dangled before slaves to encourage good servile behavior, but was not given to runaway slaves. If verse 16 is referring to manumission, something that is hotly debated among scholars, then it seems unlikely Paul is asking Philemon to manumit Onesimus. But what if instead Onesimus is sent to Paul directly and on purpose? Smith writes, this leaves open the possibility that Onesimus was sent to Paul in the hope that he would prove more useful to Paul than he had been to Philemon. But useful how? Eric Barreto is again helpful. He writes, it seems most likely that Onesimus was sent by Philemon to care for Paul in prison. As we've already discussed in other episodes, prisoners were at the mercy of their friends. The authorities provided no sustenance. Perhaps Philemon sent Onesimus to Paul upon hearing of his imprisonment to provide goods and services. But what of the language of separation in verses 15 and 16? Paul wrote, perhaps this is the reason he was separated from you for a while, so that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. Ronald Hawk in the HarperCollins Study Bible suggests that the words "was separated" constitute a tactful way of referring to Onesimus as having run away. The passive form of the verb also makes Onesimus less accountable for his action and may even suggest the working of providence. While possible, it seems unlikely. Craig Wansink in the Oxford Bible Commentary writes that slaves were separated from their masters frequently, whether it was to conduct business or deliver letters or anything else that needed to be done. Separation here could simply mean that Onesimus had been sent off to do a particular service, specifically to assist Paul in his imprisonment, as Barreto suggests. So I think the scenario plays out like this. Onesimus is a useless, and therefore bad slave for Philemon. Hearing of Paul's imprisonment, Philemon figures that if he can't find a use for Onesimus there, he might as well send him to Paul. Onesimus spends time with the apostle, becomes a Christ follower, and thus useful. But he can't stay with Paul forever. He is, after all, Philemon's slave and not Paul's, so Paul must send him back. But what is his status? In terms of the community, Onesimus is now a brother, a member of the family of the faithful. Onesimus is with Paul and becomes converted. He had been sent to Paul perhaps because he was not useful to Philemon, but could be for Paul while he was stuck in prison. Onesimus becomes a Christ follower, but now what? Paul wanted him to stay there, to be of use to him, but Onesimus isn't Paul's slave, and he has to be sent back. How is Philemon to receive him? Paul says to receive Onesimus no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother. Is he calling on Philemon to free Onesimus, or is something else going on? That's all the time we've got this week. See you next time. And remember, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, one does not need to deny what is troubling about the Bible in order to pay respect to what is heartening. Thanks for stopping by.